Dan Good, author of Ken Caminiti, Playing Through the Pain, joins the show. Diamond Diehards is on. Joe Rizzo here bringing you books again as Dan Good, the author of Ken Caminiti, Playing Through the Pain, joins the show. And you could find Dan's work at dangoodstuff.com. I mean, if that doesn't make it easy enough for you, what does? Follow him on Twitter at dgood73. We get that stuff out of the way. Abrams Press, Ken Caminiti, the official title is Playing Through the Pain. Dan, welcome to Diamond Diehards. It's good to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so the first thing we need to know, APBA as a kid and not Stratomatic. How could you explain that to our listeners? I mean, how? Like, we're like the Stratomatic people over here. How are you APBA?
I appreciate Stratomatic. I respect it. APA was really established and grew out of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. So it was in my backyard, and that's really, my father got connected to that. He loved playing it as a kid and just passed it down to me. So, it was me and my brother playing against my dad when we were kids and had a lot of fun with it.
Okay. So the point is, baseball is deeply rooted in your person, and you're talking with us now because you wrote a really cool and interesting baseball book on a man and a topic that really hasn't been breached too much. I know you've done a couple of shows before. I will admit to you, I did not read the book. However, I did the audio book. So I don't know if you've had anybody who did that.
It's all the same. It's really interesting because I think there's this idea that you need to read the book page by page, and you can digest information through the audiobook. I was really impressed by the way the audiobook turned out, and I'm happy if people read it, if they listen to the audiobook, however they read it, it's great for me.
Yeah, well, that helps me because when I tell you I'm not much of a reader, I'm not much of a reader. But I say that, but I'm not a book reader. I'm constantly reading stuff all day online and this and that. But when it comes to like sitting down and reading books, I find it difficult to like have those blocks of time. But when I'm in the car for like an hour and a half trip to a hockey game or something like that, guess what comes in handy? The audiobook.
Of course.
So I heard a lot about Ken Caminiti's life growing up. So the first thing that everybody always gets at, let's just get it out of the way, the butt throw. How did you research the butt throw? Give anything anybody wants to know about the butt throw, they're going to find out right now. We're going to get it out of the way and we'll move on to other stuff.
I just appreciated watching that YouTube video again and again and again, on repeat over the past decade. It's just such a fascinating play. The thing that really stands out to me is he just tore his rotator cuff when that play happened. This happened weeks after he tore his rotator cuff. It was in a game against Florida, the Marlins, and he's fading towards third base, leaning towards the line. He falls over. He throws the ball, guns it across the diamond, gets the runner out. And it's just such a fascinating play to watch. And I really always appreciated, too, watching him after the play. It was just so matter of fact. He just kind of put his hat back on with one hand because, again, his shoulder was really hurting him. He really couldn't do a lot. So, he actually like took one hand and put his hat back on, and it just kind of smugged and smirked and jogged off the field. The inning was over. And it was just so impressive to watch it and to see it and to recognize the ability needed to be able to know where the ball is, how he's turning. And he actually did an interview with Harold Reynolds on ESPN, in the aftermath of that play. And he was like turning a certain way and rolling a certain way. And then he realized, he had to get rid of the ball somehow, but how are you going to do that? And he just got to his butt and threw, and it's such an impressive play.
Yeah, and that's like the play that everybody really remembers out of a litany of great ones that you described in the book and helped us rehash. And of course, if you haven't read the book, you're gonna probably do the same thing as I did. You get through these parts and you're gonna go back and you're gonna look at YouTube and you're gonna remember these plays or re-remember them for the first time in a while and see just how great of a defensive player he was. And the funny thing to me, like going through this book and I'm just going to say reading it because it makes it easier to say that. Consuming the product, Dan, as I was consuming the product. In 12 different places in the second half of the book, it sort of dawned on me. The title. You had to be conflicted about some point about the title. Like, do you put steroids in there? I mean, it's in the subtitle, right? It's Ken Caminiti and the Steroids Confession that changed baseball forever, but it's not like, so it's not the main looked up title, but it's the secondary title. Were you conflicted about maybe sort of flipping it or getting the step, because he was such a key guy in this whole advent of us finding out really how deep the steroids problem was. And if he doesn't come clean the way he does, and you give such a good perspective, like there's so much that leads up to the part where he's finally sitting down with, for the interview, that by that time, you're not surprised that he actually just completely came clean. But for the rest of us, when we really found out about it, when Tom Verducci did his piece, we were all like floored by it. But then we had all this perspective. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was a really interesting thing, and obviously that's kind of the centerpiece. That really is what draws so many people in. There's certainly people who are interested in Ken and his story, and there's such a large group of people who are so focused on the steroids aspect. And I thought it was important to recognize how the steroids topic and issue factored into his life. This is obviously somebody who's struggled with substance abuse issues, who's known people who've used steroids throughout his life, high school, college, pro career. So by the time he started using, for the Padres, this wasn't some big thing for him. It wasn't a big thing, at least at the time, because so many other players were using it. His friends were using steroids. It wasn't a huge thing in that way. And I think in a way that gets overlooked for him as he's spilling out his guts to Sports Illustrated and to CNNSI about his steroid use. He's thinking the truth is going to set me free. He had just come out of rehab. He's trying to clean up his life and take stock of things and, just kind of let people know he was, following the right path. And there was no way that he recognized the implications, the hugeness of this. Jose Canseco had come out right around the same time and threw out this 85% number and said, I'm writing a book about this, which came out a couple years later. It's a really massive book. But the thing that really stood out about Ken's admission was he wasn't trying to gain anything, tangentially. He wasn't trying to sell something. He was literally just telling the truth about his story. And I think that's what really resonated. It wasn't, somebody caught. It wasn't somebody who was failed a drug test, anything like that. It was just some guy spilling his guts. And the repercussions of that were huge. It really forced baseball's hand to start looking at this. And even if it was half-hearted at first, to really start taking this seriously and start putting in measures to clean up the game. And that happened over the course of the next decade or so. But, it really set everything into motion just by him being honest and open and, talking about this topic that no one else could. Up until that point, there were so many players who would whisper about it, would talk about it kind of in passing. They wouldn't want to put their name on anything. And here's this guy, this former MVP, saying, I did this stuff. It helped me win the MVP award. And that was a huge, huge thing.
Is Ken Caminiti a tragic figure?
I think so. I think so because of the fact that, as somebody who approached telling his story, there wasn't that redemption piece. I think anybody who's a fan of his and baseball in general wanted to see him bounce back, wanted to see him happy, healthy, giving back, coaching, maybe coach high school or something. There wasn't that opportunity. He passed away so young, and in such a sad and difficult way that it made the redemption angle to his story impossible. It really did. As much as you can try to paint it and, reflect back and appreciate, the fact that people are now honoring him more openly. He's in the Padres Hall of Fame, which I think was really deserving. It's tough that, he didn't get to celebrate that in life, and that his life ended, I think, before he could reclaim that. I think now we look back and say, kudos for your honesty. And even people who are critical of him at the time can say, it meant a lot for him to stand up and say what he did. But I think at the time, and then the years that followed, it was really tough. And I think he felt that pressure, friction from baseball because he had broken the code. And, some of the respect kind of came later. And it was sad that he didn't get to smell the flowers when he was here, and kind of understand how much he meant to other people, because he meant so much to so many people.
If he ends up never using steroids, which is a big if, right? I mean, he was never at that point really where he was considering a full career without it, because he was kind of on it fairly early, like the way you described in the book. He's still going to win Gold Gloves at third base. I think we could agree on that. He never becomes the hitter that he was. Now, we talked a little bit about Stratomatic at the start of the show. So I always knew from Stratomatic that as a right-handed hitter, he was way better than he was as a left-handed hitter. But then in those years where he elevated his game, all of a sudden you would see those numbers evening out a lot more. He became a powerful left-handed hitter. He became a more consistent left-handed hitter. And that's when, he became the whole package, and it really, it didn't just put him over the top, it put him like way over the top, right? I mean, he was in that elite circle of guys. The way you mentioned, you described it very well in the book about where that 96 season stacks up historically. It's really unbelievable. And then when you throw the defense on top of it, I mean, listen, the guy who you think of today, right, is Nolan Arenado, that plays that same style. Like, he's got the range, he's got the missile arm, and his footwork was just impeccable. They're different built type of guys, but they seem to play third base the same kind of way. And if people are like, wow, this guy was as good as Nolan Arenado, yeah, he probably could have been a shortstop, right?
Yeah. The thing that really, you're exactly right. The thing that stands out to me is you look at Adrian Beltre, who's growing up in the Dominican Republic, 13 years old. He's watching this Astros broadcast on TV, and he watches Ken play and says, I want to be like that guy, and becomes the next great, along with Scott Rowland, like the next great defensive third baseman to come on after Ken. And Nolan Arenado is watching TV at home as a kid, and he sees Adrian Beltre play and says, I want to be like that guy. And he's the next great defensive third baseman. It's that, passing of the torch of great players at the hot corner. And, it's just so impressive. You have a couple players who were at that caliber of, like Ken. Obviously, Brooks Robinson was, a different breed than everybody, and he was so much more smooth at third baseman than Ken was. You have Manny Machado now, who's a lot more smooth than Ken is too. But Ken just was so he was so precise. He was so bruising. He had always dirt all over his uniform. Like, you could tell how difficult it was from watching him play. And it was just so impressive seeing the reflexes, seeing that first movement, understanding how he would watch, the batter in the batter's box, and then the bat come through the zone, and understand this is where the ball is going to go based on the bat, and being able to understand that and get in position and make the throw. And obviously that arm was the thing that stood out for him. That arm was, it was him and Sean Dunston who had the best arms in the majors at that time. And it was just so impressive seeing the whole package. And yet he was playing these games for these bad Astros teams, and no one seemed to notice. Other people were winning the Gold Glove award. And that's one of the frustrating things about the Gold Glove voting back then is, they'd usually honor players who made the All-Star team, who won the MVP award, whose teams made the playoffs. And I feel like somebody like Ken kind of got lost in the mix. He kind of got overlooked for a couple years there, and it really kind of aided him because he really prided himself on his defense, and he knew that he was the best third baseman defensively in the National League, and he's still not winning the Gold Glove. It's Matt Williams. And Matt Williams was great too, not taking anything away from him. But one of the things that I really appreciated was talking to Matt Williams about Ken playing third base. And he said Ken was the gold standard. And I really do think that. I think that, when he was at his best at third base on defense, he just played at a different level than the other players. And he was awesome. And that was the area of the game that he prided himself on the most. So even though he became that home run hitter, and that was an exciting thing for him, nothing beat him making that great play and getting the guy out of first base.
Yeah, he was a little more mechanical as he got more bulky. But if you watch the highlights from the early years of the Astros, very much like Arenado. Like you watch him go back where he was more lithe up top. He wasn't as muscle bound, but he still played it a little bit the same way, but just a little more mechanical as he got into those Padres years. You talked about Matt Williams. You talked about interviewing him. Give everybody a little take on how you were able to conduct all these interviews and maybe some of the different quotes were things that you looked up from periodicals or found other interviews online. So tell us a little bit about like the in-person or Zoom interviews or phone interviews first, and then let's talk a little bit about some of the research.
It was really interesting. Going into this, I did about a year's worth of research before I started calling anybody because I felt like maybe, am I the right person to tell this story? Does somebody closer to him, somebody who's covered him, want to cover it instead? Is there a book in the pipeline? I didn't want to start embarrassing myself by just cold calling people and getting shut down. So for a year or so, I just did research. I didn't talk to anybody about it. And I just felt like there was something there. And then I put together, I'm a spreadsheet person. I put together spreadsheet upon spreadsheet of every single team he was on, dating to his little league days, high school, college, minor league, all the way through, and I said, all right, who am I going to call? And it was kind of just a grab bag of reaching out to people, emailing them, trying to figure out, oh, they were at this camp. They, coach this camp for kids now. Oh, they're on Facebook. Let me try to get them. I did do a number of interviews through Teams, and that was really more earlier on. Somebody like Gary Tuck was a good example. I went to Yankee Stadium and interviewed Gary Tuck, who was a longtime coach. He had 3 or 4 World Series rings between the Yankees and the Red Sox, and he was Ken's minor league manager at Columbus in 1986 when they went worst to first and won the championship. It was really fascinating to kind of, track people down, see what they're doing with their lives. Bobby Cox is another example. Like I tried to go through the Braves and I didn't get anywhere because I'm sure they get a ton of requests for Bobby Cox. And this was, 5, 6, 7 years ago. This is before he had his health issues. But, I wasn't getting anywhere with the Braves. So I just found some phone numbers. I started calling. I got him on the phone and he said, a tree fell on my house. Can you call me back tomorrow? And I was like, yeah, sure. So I called him back to the next day and, was able to talk to him for 10 or 15 minutes. He was great. Bruce Bochy was another one. I tried for years through the Giants and it just never worked out. We were trying to set something up when they were playing the Mets because I live, in New York. And we're trying to set something up when they were in town to play the Mets. This was in like 2013 or 2014. And it just didn't work out. I had a family commitment and they were only going to give me 10 minutes. And I was like, well, I'm going to need more than 10 minutes to talk to Bruce. So it just didn't work out. And I could never set it up. And then he retired. He announced I guess he was leaving. He wasn't retired. He's now back with the Rangers. They announced he was going to be his final season with the Giants. I was like, well, that's going to be tough, because he's going to be very busy. So I waited. And then we find ourselves in 2020. And I just said, you know what, I'm calling whatever numbers I have. I just tracked down some numbers for him, left a message, and I don't know, a week or 10 days later, I get a call from this number. I just saved it in my phone as Bruce Bochy ? Is it him? Is it not him? So I get a call back from this number, and I was like, I'm sure this is somebody saying I got the wrong number. And I pick it up, and it's Bruce Bochy with the gravelly voice. And I was like, oh my gosh, just a rush talking to him. We ended up talking for like 45 minutes, and he was wonderful. And it was just, there was so many little things that, I found. One of the most impressive ones that I found was this person who had this bar encounter with Ken when he was on a rehab assignment in 1999. And I found a post on a message board that this person had made from like 2007 talking about it. And it was still online. And I figured out what his like username was in this system. And then I searched around for the username and matched it up with the person and sent them a message because I thought it might be them. And I get a call that night. And it's like, how did you find me? That was always the most impressive thing when somebody was like, how did you find me? But it's a lot of detective work. It's a lot of just sleuthing around, and then it just, kind of connecting through different people. I talked to one person and then they mentioned somebody else's name. And I say, oh, do you have their number? Is there a way to contact them, or can you reach out to them on my behalf? So it just became this, chain reaction. And, I was working overnights at the time. So I had all this free time during the day. So I'd wait until, 10 o'clock, 10:30 in the morning, or if it was on the West Coast, I'd wait till 1 o'clock in the afternoon and start calling people, and it was just really neat to track down players, friends, people who knew Ken, and try to piece the story together and try to make sense of it. And it really required that triangulation because a lot of times, he wasn't always truthful in the interviews he gave. And it was just a matter of like, is this person telling me the truth or not? Because sometimes I talk to somebody and they tell me something, and then I'd call a different source and they'd be like, no, that's not accurate at all. So it's that trying to get it right. And, in terms of research, I tracked down every magazine article, every interview I could. YouTube was really helpful in these old games that are posted online. It was great to watch them. I got some video from Major League Baseball. They just gave me video footage from games on DVDs, which was fun. SB Awards, and it was interesting too, like looking at so many different newspaper articles that are now online, like newspapers.com. That was really helpful because a lot of these databases didn't exist or weren't really as organized when I started the project. And then 6, 7, 8 years later, like everything's changed and there's all this information online that I can find at my fingertips. But then there was other pieces of it that, was really tough to track down or had to go that extra level. I got Ken's high school stats from his coach, how Kolstad had given them to me. And it was funny because I interviewed him, he was at home and I interviewed him. And then a year or two after that, I was talking to a player of his from one of his teams, and they had this sheet of stats. And I was like, oh, like this would be really helpful. So then I was able to track that down. Or San Jose State University's archives were helpful. They gave me media guides. It was just, it was really fascinating to track down everything. Even when I interviewed Tom Gamboa, who was Ken's Winter League coach in 1988 and 89, he talked about this great win streak the team went on, and I couldn't track down anything. And I ended up finding, I think it was a Miami newspaper had published these articles about the team in Spanish. So I had to translate them through Google and figure it out. And it all matched up. It was just a matter of like finding the information and facts to back up what other people had told me, or using the research and facts to ask better questions and get more information.
So one interesting part that I found was you did do a lot of like game by game detail in some of the earlier parts of his career, like in high school and specifically college. There was a lot of like game by game, he was 2 for 3. And I was sort of wondering for a while where you're going. I'm like, this seems to be like quite a bit of detail in some of these spots. The thing that I really liked, Dan, that you did was you established the groundwork to show that he was a really streaky player, like from way back, like from the time he was a kid. And a problem, and you were able to like associate it, maybe nasciently, but like maybe not as much outwardly, with the ups and downs in his life. Like as things were maybe going well, he would go on a streak, and then the streak would get dismantled because of an injury or because of something personal happening there. So, and it's like you and I just talked, we talked very briefly before we started this. So all of this is real fresh, and we've never met before. So I did say it was nice to meet you. But we talked about, we had Jeff Pearlman on, and he just did a book about Bo Jackson.
Yeah.
Very extensively interviewed, very similar styles in the way that that you guys both do it. Just find everybody, call anybody who will answer the phone, and talk to whoever you could talk to, and then put the whole piece together. It's the stuff that you discover is, you probably have so much stuff that you didn't even put in the book. I would imagine, right?
I did. I do. There's so much. I mean, there were stories that I heard about Alex Rodriguez from 2001 spring training with the Rangers that I wanted to put in. I was like, I can't source this. I don't have anybody else backing this up. And I would love to burn this guy. I'm not an A-Rod fan, but I just couldn't. There was so many other pieces that were really tough to piece together. In terms of his college years, going back to the point you just made, the the San Jose State newspaper did a really great job of covering his team and covering the pieces of it. So it was really great to be able to talk to the players and talk to them about specific things that happened during the season and trying to piece it all together, because there's one thing you can read from the articles themselves, and here's what happened at this game, and Ken was playing left field at one point because they had another third baseman that they liked. He wasn't as good as Ken, but he was still solid, and they were a better team with both of them in the lineup. And then he got hurt, and then Ken moved back. The biggest thing that happened probably during his college days was the collision that he had with the catcher his junior season, and it really sent him. You're exactly right. It sent him into a slump, for a good part of the season, and he was able to bounce back, but he came back too quickly from the injury, as we saw so many times during his career. He was raring to go and would get back into the lineup, and that's what really got me, was seeing the parallels. You see what happened when he gets food poisoning in Mexico, and he gets his IV fluids and eats a Snickers bar and goes out and hits 2 home runs. But those events happened other times. When he was in winter ball, when he was in college, those events happened then too. People just weren't paying attention to it. So I think we see what he was on the national stage at his highest points. He was always that kind of player. Obviously he transformed into more of a power hitter, but he was always that kind of player. He had the same mentality, from his high school and college days on forward. So it was really neat to connect some of those dots and to see the patterns and to see how they all fit together.
Yeah, and his grittiness, and problems, some of the issues that he had when he was very young, you brought those to light. That had to be a difficult decision for you to decide to air some of that stuff out. I know there's, maybe rules and HIPAA laws and stuff like that, but that's for when people are still alive, and when they're passed, I guess some of that stuff, if it becomes part of the public domain, doesn't really violate those things, but it's still, I guess you must have had some kind of morality decision to decide that, we're going to either talk about this or we're going to not, and you brought it out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was that decision. And for me, it was, let me get this from enough people to feel comfortable with it. When I first talked to his attorney near the end of his life, and this was in about 2014, and he told me that, Ken's addiction issues were fueled by some childhood trauma. He wouldn't go into details. He was restricted by attorney-client privilege from saying any further to me. But when he told me that, it was really crushing and devastating. But it also didn't. I couldn't connect anything to it. I didn't know. It was like, okay, what happened? And I didn't even know where to begin asking about that. And it just kind of stuck with me, but I didn't know what to do with it. And then I started talking, I would say a year and a half to 2 years later, with somebody who had gone to rehab with him and said that Ken had told them that they had been sexually abused as a kid. And it was so horribly sad. to learn that. I remember that interview really distinctly and vividly. And, it really kind of galvanized for me that there was something more there, but it's so delicate and difficult. And you also don't know, these are people who are hearing it secondhand. These are people who are having Ken tell them, but being able to piece it all together still was elusive and difficult. And, I try to see how far I could go with it, and it really didn't get anywhere. And I do research and find out, little pieces that didn't connect to anything. And then I talked to, two other people who had gone to rehab with him a year and a half to 2 years after that. And they confirmed or told me the same things. And that's when I was like, okay, I have four different people over the course of 7 years telling me kind of the same thing. Even if they're not really telling me a lot, they're telling me the same thing. And that's where, for me, it became real. And that's a new tragedy, because then it's like, I can't steer clear of this. And that's what was really difficult, is balancing the need to get the story right with the need to protect anybody I could, because, this is such a tragic and devastating and difficult story to tell. And I think you can easily cross over that boundary and get salacious with his story. And it really diminishes the feeling that people have about it. There's that fine line where you can go far, too far, and then there's the other fine line where you don't go far enough. And I thought that was a disservice, because I really do feel like there's so much that we can learn from Ken's life, and there's so much that we can learn from his successes and struggles. And I think a lot of times when people told his story, they skewed toward the safe, sugary story about Ken. And I felt like I needed to be able to tell it fully and, honestly and authentically. But there was so much inner strife in terms of balancing that, and balancing every need there, and telling it, you know, to its the fullest degree that I could, while also being sensitive and fair. And, it was a really difficult thing, and it was a really difficult thing to dive into and make sense of, and try to write in a way that was, honest but fair, and just get it all right. But it was the toughest part. That and his death were the two parts of the book that were the most difficult for me to report and to write. And, I still struggle to even look at them today. Like, I'm happy to go and look at parts of the book, and, great, he was awesome on defense. There's these other pieces of it that I'm like, I can't revisit because they're painful for me too.
I'm going to give you a compliment here, Dan, and it's to sum it up. I'll say we look so much now at the steroid era argument in terms of the people who are not in the Hall of Fame, right? Bonds and Clemens, are at the forefront. Other guys, as part of the mix now and in the future. But that's they're the head of that class. And then you look back to a Caminiti, and you look at his 96 season, and if you're on these guys should never belong in the Hall of Fame side, you're also on the side of, that 96 season. Yeah, he gets the MVP, but I really don't count it as anything. So I'll say this: no matter which side of the argument you'd be on, and I think probably most people are on at least one side. There's probably a few in the middle, but most have a take on it. No matter which side you're on, Dan, after consuming your book, the thing I could look at, especially about 96, and then also about the rest of Caminiti's career, is I could say, I understand. I understand why. I understand how and why he was in this position. And look, I mean, I'm just a person. I can't judge another person. That's just the way I look at it. I know most people are a little more judgmental. I'm non-judgmental, probably to a fault. But I got a real understanding of why he was just like doomed for this fate. And I appreciate you stepping up to tell a hard story. Like, where is his redemption in this whole thing? I think there was some. I think it is when he's sitting down with that CNN SI producer, and he's talking about, like, I think that it turns out that's it. I don't think he necessarily felt it that way. I think you put aspects around it that suggested that maybe he did have a cathartic moment at that time, and at worst he felt like he was doing the right thing, and that the truth was going to set him free. But in retrospect, and with regard to the book, at least I feel like you gave him that moment, and people can go back and look at this story, and like, we don't always have to read the rosy happy ending stuff, right? Like, life's not always like that. So I appreciate that you did all that work. I like the way that you framed it. And like I said, I wasn't always sure where you were going, but then after a while, I like, the more in retrospect I would think about it, like, I see what he did there. I see what, like, especially the parts like about the San Jose State, like, that comes in so key in the Padres part of the book where you're talking about that. I'm like, the San Diego State. Now I'm like, now I understand why we went into such detail about that, because of course I didn't know who he was when he was at San Jose State, but I knew who he was when he was an Astro and a Padre. So good work by Mr. Good on that. Next thing. So you've been like sort of behind the scenes in a lot of books and a lot of writing. Is this actually number one that your name is on?
It's one of them. It's really been interesting because I became a book ghostwriter starting in 2019. I had worked in journalism in New York City for about a decade, and in Pennsylvania and New Jersey before then. And I got to the point where I had a 2-year-old son at home that I didn't see enough. I'd be FaceTiming on the way home because he was going to sleep and I didn't get to see him all day. And I said, all right, I'm going to need to make a change here and really rebalance. And, decided book ghostwriting seemed like a good idea. Work from home. This is a new concept. This is 2019. I thought work from home was this really cool thing. A year later, everybody was working from home, but at the time, not a lot of people were. And, really dove into it. It requires all the same skills that I have as a journalist, interviewing people, writing stories that are fascinating, finding the best way into a story, connecting all the dots, having a point. There's all these skills that are involved in, meeting deadlines, another one. There's all these skills that translate really well. So I got really connected to book ghostwriting, picked up a couple projects. And from there, it was really interesting because I'd work on book proposals for people and, try to get their books sold. And, they keep telling me, oh, I have a really interesting story to tell. And at this point, I'd been working on this book about Ken for 7 years without an agent, without a publisher lined up, without anything, just for free, just for fun. And by this point, I'd interviewed far over 300 people. And I said, all right, if you think you have an interesting story to tell, I have an interesting story to tell. So, ghostwriting and working through that process and being behind the scenes really helped me to feel more comfortable moving forward in front of the scenes and putting this book out there. And the other thing that really helped me was, by the time I wrote this book, I'd already written, I don't know, 4 or 5 other books as a ghostwriter. So it really helped me understand how to write a book. So by the time I wrote this one, it wasn't my first. I've written a book about Microsoft. I wrote a book about Trump University. I co-wrote that one. And then there's a lot of books that I ghost wrote. And, it's just a really interesting process because each project's different. And, I think it makes me a sharper ghostwriter to actually know what it feels like to go through the publication process yourself. And I also like the ghostwriting process sometimes because it's nice not always being in front. You can sometimes be behind the scenes and help other people instead of, here's my book and I have to go promote it. I love, doing interviews for this book because it's so personal to me. But, I could see if you're not really connected to a project, it feels like a drain to be plugging it out there all the time. So it's nice to to write the book, and then you're on to something else. You get to move on and not worry about the promotion side. So I like that balance of, being able to do my own projects and then ghostwriting as well. And it's fascinating because you're constantly meeting new people, learning new things, and kind of better understanding the world.
Tell me more about the ghostwriting part. Like, do you have to sign an NDA? Like, or is it like a big secret, or like how does that work?
Sometimes it is. It really depends. I haven't signed many NDAs. I've signed a couple. It really depends on the client and the project and who's attached to it. If it's a really big publisher and a really big agent, there might be more secrecy around it. And then it also, a lot of this gets mapped out in the contract phase, but you'll basically be told or have a say in, how you're presented. Sometimes you have a cover credit, a with cover credit says with so and so. Sometimes you're credited in the acknowledgments. Other times you are completely hidden and behind the scenes. You're the person behind the curtain that no one knows about. And with the ghostwriting process, typically it involves me meeting with the client, either the author, the person I'm working with. I will meet with them either in person or over the phone or over Zoom. I actually don't prefer Zoom calls for ghostwriting. Most of my calls have been over the phone. I just feel like there's a more personal thing. I think too, because a book is a written thing without visuals, I kind of feel like, it's neat for me to explore this story, just over the phone, just hearing it that way. But meet with the person, talk to them, interview them. And the first step would be outlining. You outline, and this is another thing that was really beneficial for my book on Ken was understanding how to outline. Without understanding how to outline, I don't know where I'm going with the book, and I don't know what's in or out of the book. With outlining, and I spent a lot of time getting that outline into shape, I could really focus and say, okay, I'm going to write this chapter today about this topic because it's important. And then all the other things I didn't need to worry about, I could just let them disappear and fade away. So outlining is huge. I really love to be able to outline. And then, from there, it just, meeting with the client, getting their words, and then using their words and building out the chapters with their words. I think one of the key things as a ghostwriter is learning to not write as yourself. You're sounding like somebody else, and that's a really tough skill, and it took a lot of time for me to get used to that. And it helped that I had spent so much time editing other people's copy. As an editor, as a journalist, you're so focused on sounding like that person. So when I could step into the ghostwriting role, it was the same thing. It was like, okay, I want this to sound like you. I don't want this to sound like me. I love my writing, but I want this to sound like you. One of the biggest obstacles I've dealt with is when a client wants to sound differently than the way I wrote it. And there's a inner struggle because I'm saying like, hey, I'm a good writer, you should listen to me, but it's their words. So if you want to sound this way, go for it. But yeah, I didn't write it this way. I think it's more effective the other way. But so I think there's some balance and some give and take there, which is frustrating sometimes. But all in all, I enjoy it, and it's a lot of fun to be able to help other people tell their stories and to bring their stories out.
How does it work contractually? Like, does it depend on book sales, or like, or is it different every time?
It's different every time, but a lot of times for my projects, I will be contracted for the writing itself and for some of the editing, making sure the manuscript's in the shape, and that's it. And book sales, I don't have anything to do with. It's really up to the author whose name is on the cover to work through those things. And it really does depend, though. There's sometimes where you'll be a little bit more connected to a book through publication, but a lot of times you're focused on the writing, and that's it. And as much as it's nice to understand how a book's selling and be a part of that process, it's also nice not to be, sometimes, because then you're not so worried about, oh, I have to sell X number of copies and I need to, do X, Y, and Z. With my book, it's been interesting because, It came out in late May, and in the June, July, it's selling really well, and then it starts to fade down. You're like, okay, well, how can we work on this? Do we do more interviews? Do we do Facebook ads? Do we do Amazon ads? There's all of these things you can do to kind of game the system and to to sell more copies. And for me, it was really interesting because you had the Padres in the playoffs and going deep for the first time since 1998, and you had the Astros in the playoffs and going deep. So it was this dream scenario where I was really hoping it would be Astros Padres, Ken Caminiti World Series. Obviously the Astros won out and the Phillies beat the Padres, but it was really interesting to see this spike happen and see this conversation focus more on 98 again, because here's the first time the Padres were this good since then. And that really drove me to putting more force and energy and effort behind my ads online. So, getting ready for the holiday season, it was really interesting to plug in different things on Amazon for sales and say, all right, this is really hitting right now. This is really cool. I don't have that for a lot of the ghostwriting projects, but it's a balance. And, for me, it's the craft. It's all about the craft and, telling the best story. And the promotion side's a little foreign. I think any journalist would agree. It's different. You're not used to this. You're not used to going and telling people to go buy. Usually it's just like, oh, this is important, you should read it, and you'll read it in the newspaper, you read it free online, whatever it is. Now it's like, oh, go buy my book. It's just a different process.
Can you share any? You've hinted at a couple there. Can you share any of the other titles? So if people want to go into a Dan Good rabbit hole.
I'm trying to think. So I have one that I worked on that's coming out next month. I'm going to be promoting it on socials. It's by this man named Sean Hayes, who was a banker in St. Louis. He was very successful. And he, 2004, 2003, 2004, he sells his bank to a bigger bank. And then he gets sucked up as a, middle manager, upper middle manager, and, is out of the game, and then he re-enters the game in like 2008 amid the financial crisis, ends up, going to prison for bank fraud, for, some bad transactions, and is trying to, pick up the pieces of his life now and move forward. And I'm really proud of that project. That's going to be coming out next month. It's interesting because a lot of times you end up speaking in generalities and say, oh, I worked on this politics project. I worked on, this thought leader CEO project. I worked on, the one that I was really proud of. I was only working on it for a couple months. There was a book that came out with an addiction doctor earlier last year. Now it's next year, but it was 2022. And it was like a Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestseller. That was really interesting. So it's interesting to speak in generalities about these projects. There's not really a clear rabbit hole. I think a lot of people might look at my social media feed and not really know what I'm doing. And yet I'm working on like 4 or 5 different books at any time. You just don't know about it. So it's interesting to be kind of in the middle of it all.
Who killed JFK? Could you do, or should we do that on a separate episode, Dan? I know you have all the information.
All of it. Oh, there's so many answers out there.
Yeah. But we know that you have the actual one. So all right. So this was sort of a long the Playing Through the Pain book about Ken Caminiti. Like you said, it's like literally a pet project, something you worked on for many, many years. You come out with it, you put it out there. Do you have you talked about like being busy and making a living, but do you have plans for any other books? I mean, in the baseball realm, completely outside, that you will do as projects with your name on it?
I have a couple of things I'm kicking around. Nothing in the pipeline yet. I talk to my agent pretty regularly. Joe Perry, he's awesome. He has the same name as the Aerosmith musician. He's awesome. But I talk to him regularly about projects, and he'll send me some. I'm like, I wanted to feel that spark. There was a spark with this Ken project that is tough to replicate. And, I think it's tough when you're so committed and passionate about something. I know what that meant to me, and I don't want the next thing I pick to not feel that way. You know, there's a couple things I'm kicking around. You know, one of them's in baseball. I haven't committed to anything yet, and I'm just kind of waiting to see how the chips fall and see how things come together. But I definitely want to explore in sports further, you know, as much as I see myself as a generalist and, you know, like writing books about anything. I happen to feel like I'm pretty knowledgeable about baseball and love baseball. And I think that's an interesting thing too, working on books on topics that I'm not as familiar with, and then having to like educate myself. You know, there's an education curve with a lot of these topics. Baseball, there's not an education curve. It's I understand how this game works, and you know, here it is. You know, so I do feel like to be honest, I want to explore more in the steroids era. I think that it's an underlooked resource and opportunity. I think that the publishing world is so focused on New York, and there's obviously a Yankees Mets bias, and that's not a bad thing. You know, I think there should be books about the Yankees and Mets, but I think there should be books about everybody, every team. You know, and you know, see these opportunities pop up for what they are. I mean, you know, a book on Ken that you know explored so many difficult topics. You know, shouldn't be pushed aside because he played for the Padres and the Astros. Like that's an important story. You know, I think there's so many important stories to tell in baseball and in sports that tell deeper things about our lives and about our world and you know the way we see things. And that was what was so neat to me about the story about Ken. And a couple people have told me about this, that it's not really as much of a baseball book. It's more of about a book about life. And you know, I strive to tell those kind of stories, the stories that go deeper and not just, you know, hey, somebody hit 50 home runs or did this. You know, I see a lot of the projects that are focused on the same players again and again, you know, and I want to see the range of stories told. I want to see so many stories told. And, you know, I'm always interested in exploring like what's that next great story, because I feel like, you know, there's another one. Yeah, I don't know if it's going to feel the same, but I want to tell a new story. So when the timing's right, when it feels right, definitely going to jump back in and, you know, tackle a new topic.
When you were doing any of the interviews, did it sort of like a similar name ever come across? Be like, oh, you should do a book on this guy, or you should do a book on this guy. Like sometimes that's how it happens, right? Like you everybody like four people say the same thing. You're like, what? Why should I be doing a book about this guy? You know?
Yeah, no, that has happened, and I'm not going to say the name, but there is somebody that was brought up to me like two or three times as I was talking about my book on Ken. And I was like, that would be interesting, you know, and that does happen. You know, I think that there's so much focus on Bonds, Clemens, A-Rod, McGuire, couple of 4 or 5, Sammy Sosa. It's like five guys get all the attention, but there's so many stories. You know, I go back. I had talked a little bit to Richie Lewis, who has since passed away. He's a pitcher, journeyman pitcher. I interviewed him for my book, and we had talked about doing a book together, and it didn't really go any very far, the conversation. But I just feel like there's so much of that to tell. You know, there's so many stories like that really matter, that I think get overlooked, and they shouldn't. You know, I think these stories need to be told and documented and commemorated and celebrated. So there was definitely a couple names that got tossed out, and one specifically that I'm maybe thinking about, but it just hasn't lined up. I need people to participate and get on board with it, and they're not yet, but keeping my fingers crossed.
Well, if and when that one comes through, I want to know about it.
Yes.
B, I'm Italian, so I keep secrets really, really well. And C, you know, we're gonna want to promote it because we are Dan Good fans over here at Diamond Diehards. Once again, follow him at dgood73 on Twitter. Go to dangoodstuff.com to keep up with everything that's going on in the world of Dan Good. And I had a little list here, and I think I covered everything. And a few things that I didn't know about that I learned. So to me, that makes a show pretty good. We have to do a little business. We have a few people that help us out, and they are Gatto Acupuncture, FMSgraphics.com, the Mascolo Group Realtors, and Big Ed's Car Wash. And what we're going to do for this one is we're going to say, like always, to find out more about those companies that help us out and make a good podcast, it's always in the description. All the information is in the description of the show, no matter where if you're watching it on YouTube, if you're checking it out on Facebook or on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever it is, go down there, hit those. And we also put Dan's information in there as well. And I very highly encourage everybody to go get a copy of the book, or do as I did, the audio book. It always provides for an interesting twist and an interesting turn, because Billy Spears was mentioned over and over and over again.
I know.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, not Billy Spires. Billy. Oh, come on! Like, there were a couple. There were a few others. I can't remember exactly who. I sometimes, like, I want to make a note of it, like if I figure, like, we're ever going to do something on the air. And but most of the time, like, I was listening while I was driving, or I'm out like on a long walk or something like that, and I'm not like sitting there making notes. But yeah, it was good. It was good to hear some of those names bringing me back. Corey Schneider was an interesting one, and this is for the Fordham crew here. So way back, like a million years ago, when I had come out of my shell, and since I've since gone back in, Corey Schneider was playing right field for the Indians at a sparsely attended New York Yankees game, probably in somewhere around 1989. And Corey Schneider hit an opposite field home run that literally was about to go in my hands, and it hit the bar right in front of me.
Wow.
And one of our friends that we were with dove onto the ball, and he got it. So we were immediate. Like, the Yankees were so bad back then. Like, people have no idea. Like,
Yes.
the time that the Yankees were playing while I was at Fordham, which was like 87 to 91, they were like the worst team in the league, and people can't even comprehend that. So we would go to the stadium, there was like nobody there. So we basically were having like a conversation with Corey Schneider in right field. Like, and the big line was, "Hey, Corey, can you get yourself traded to the Yankees, because we suck?" So it was cool. Like, I thought about that when you were going over like Team USA, and Corey Schneider was playing third base ahead of Ken Caminiti, which now seems like, you're like, how is that even possible? Like, one guy was a perennial Gold Glover, and the other guy couldn't even play third base in the majors. They had to move him to the outfield.
Yeah, no, but Corey was hot back then. He was the top prospect in baseball, one of the top three. The thing that was really interesting for me, and it was a bigger piece of that Team USA, was that the players didn't get along. They did later, after they could look back and appreciate it. But in the moment when they're fighting for 20 spots, even with Ken and Corey, there was friction, because they're competing, and Ken has never been on the bench his whole life. And now he has this other guy playing ahead of him. He's sitting on the bench next to Barry Larkin, and they're both like, "Hey, we should get more playing time. What's going on?" And Will Clark and Mark McGwire weren't getting along. So it was really interesting seeing the friction, and they really, the players try to like downplay it, but there was real friction back then. They could look back later and appreciate each other. But at the time, they were just, competing. They were really at this key moment, and they all wanted to play, and they were the hottest player in baseball. And like, Corey was the guy. He was one of the 2 or 3 guys on that team that everybody was focused on. He's hitting aluminum bat home runs over the outfield wall in Comiskey. Like, he's just doing crazy things, and you're like, oh, this guy's going to be the next Hall of Famer. And he had a respectable career in the majors, but he wasn't Ken, he wasn't some of these other guys. And I think that's tough, because you see what they are as prospects, and you're like, oh, they're going to be awesome. And sometimes prospects don't pan out the same way.
Yeah, Schneider, he was like on the cover of all the prospect magazines back then. Yeah, like he was like a can't miss guy. Yep. And I mean, imagine how good he'd be today.
Oh my gosh.
231 with 36 homers, right? Like, and now he'd be like a god. Back then, it was like, oh, this guy's only hitting 231. We can't carry his bat.
Yeah.
All right, Dan. So appreciative that you took time with us. I encourage people to go check out the book and check out Good Stuff. And we hope to have you on periodically. I mean, now, we already went through the selling thing. We can come on and just talk about baseball or just see what you're up to, or
That'd be awesome.
any of the new secret projects when they're coming out. That
Yeah, that'd be
is
awesome.
that would be cool. Dan Good, everybody. And that is going to do it for this episode of the show. If you like us, hit the subscribe button and the alerts button everywhere. YouTube, the Apple Podcasts app, the Spotify app. We know most of you are on Apple Podcasts, but you also, if you haven't joined our Facebook group, that is probably the most popular place where people consume the show. But it depends week to week. You never know. This one, I have a feeling, is going to have some legs, so we'll have a lot of people enjoying it. And don't forget to go follow Dan on Twitter. He's a good follow, dgood73, and dangoodstuff.com. You just nailed it. Take advantage of the name. That would be like me. I should take advantage of like the Jerky Boys, the Rizzo name. So people our age will probably get that. Maybe people, a few generations back might not. Anyway, that is going to do it for this episode of the show. And we'll be back as we continue the march toward spring training here. A couple of good surprises, and then the regular shows with Dog and I. For the awesome Dan Good, this is Joe Rizzo. Diamond Diehards is out.